guy. So my guest today is Brian Klaas. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me. It's delightful to be here.
Yes, and I'm very, very excited about this interview. And Brian's book, Fluke, came out, I believe, in January, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a new book. It's already making waves. It's not your first book, as far as I know. But I truly believe it's one of those iconic books which people will be talking about for years. And trust me, due to my work, I read a lot of books, pretty much a book a week, plus all the books that I read for just for joy. So I'm not saying these words lightly. So I'm really glad to start these interviews with such an amazing book. But first, traditionally, I have to read out the bio. And I will confess I took the bio from the book because I find it's the best. So Brian Klaas grew up in Minnesota, earned his Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford, and is now a professor of global politics at University College London. He's a contributing writer to The Atlantic, host of the award-winning Power Corrupts podcast, and frequent guest on national television. Brian Klaas has conducted field research across the globe and advised major politicians and organizations, including NATO and the European Union. So, I've read from the book and from here and there that you actually were involved in the American politics. So knowing that you are in UK and you're a professor there in the university. How did you get involved? And I know it's not about the book, but your first book was about Power Corrupts. I understand it's about the American politics. How did that interest come? And yeah, maybe just as a background to our conversation today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a political scientist by training. And so I started doing research around the world into rigged elections and coups and civil wars and all sorts of interesting and fascinating and disturbing topics. And one of the things that really struck me, and this is sort of the origin story of where Fluke comes out of, was how sometimes very small events can have very big impacts. And I sort of tucked this in the drawer for a long time while I was writing about stuff more related to my own field of politics and social science and so on. And there was this big question about why things happen. And that was something that percolated throughout all of my research is, why was this little tiny detail so influential in toppling this government or in changing the trajectory of history? And that eventually led to me sitting down and writing Fluke over the span of a couple years, trying to figure out how we can make sense of sometimes arbitrary, chaotic, uncontrollable events and how they sway history and affect our lives. And that's where it comes into the world of personal growth and development as well.
Mm-hmm. I just couldn't help thinking as I was reading your book, and I have to confess that probably most of the people who are watching this interview will be watching this interview haven't read the book, so I will ask questions, assuming that people don't know what the book is about exactly. So while I was reading a book, and your book, sorry if I simplify too much, is in essence about how chaos and randomness determines pretty much everything about our lives and our existence. Now, you know what I was thinking about? So you studied sociology and politics in school, and then and these are the sciences which, in essence, try to put order into our reality, or put it into that mold and try to explain it in simple terms. And then you wrote the book about chaos and chance. It's like, and sorry if this analogy is a little bit strong for some, but it's like, studying religion and then writing a book about atheism. How did this happen? Where was the first time when you suspected that it's a huge illusion?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the early experiences I had in studying a coup attempt, and I'll get this back to the sort of more relevant side of personal growth and so on in a second, but I was studying this coup attempt where everyone had written this very ordered, detailed explanation of why the government had not fallen and so on. And I interviewed a soldier who tried to kidnap someone, and he grabbed this general basically by the leg of his pants, the leg of his trousers. And the guy slipped through his fingers, and that was the deciding factor in whether the coup succeeded or failed. And everything in sociology and political science, but also in a lot of how our world operates, is trying to cram the messiness, the complexity, the infinite causes that determine the trajectories of our societies and our lives into really neat and tidy stories, which social scientists call models, right? And
Mhm.
models are basically how the world runs. It's economic models, forecasting, all sorts of things, which are trying to basically write the chaos into a formula that seems more ordered. And I think there's something happening in modern society where a lot of people are continually trying to cram their lives and also social change into this really ordered trajectory, trying to like sort of make sense of really chaotic dynamics where things are unexpected or uncertain. And I think one of the problems is that it just doesn't work. You can't write out the chaos. And so what the book is trying to do is try, I mean, some of it takes aim at some of the sort of social sciencey prescriptions about how we think the world is tameable and ordered. Our lives exist somewhere between chaos and order, right? It's not complete disorder, it's not complete order. And so what I think is important is to recognize that, accept it, and then what became the sort of outgrowths of this that have relevance for ordinary lives is to say to people, look, there is chaos that's always going to be there. A lot of the industry that tries to give people advice says eliminate it, right? And you can't. You simply cannot eliminate chaos from your life. So the question then becomes, what do you do with it? And I think the answer is that there's actually some upside to it if you understand how to embrace it, harness it, and play with it more effectively. And so that's what the book is basically saying, is it's saying it is true that arbitrary, sometimes random, chaotic events sway the trajectories of our lives. What do we do about it? How do we make sense of it? And I think it's actually a much more uplifting message than the sort of scariness of the word chaos might otherwise be perceived among the general public.
It was some other book a while ago that I read, the idea that sometimes when we try to create order in our lives or in unpredictable phenomena, we create more damage, more trouble. So what's the problem with trying to tame the chaos?
Yeah, so I love that question because I think there is a problem, and I think this exists in a lot of the ways that we're told how to live better lives in modern society. So if you open, just randomly Googling, life hacks or generally self-help advice and so on, a lot of it is about optimizing your life to eliminate the inefficiency, right? Especially the life hack world, where it's sort of how can you hustle a little bit faster, a little bit more efficiently, and so on. And I think actually, when you get to the limits of that, you actually create a lack of resilience when you optimize too much. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is that, there is some slack that we need both in our lives and our social systems. And I'll give an illustration from social systems, and then I'll make the point about our own lives. So a couple of years ago, many of you will have seen that the Suez Canal got blocked when a boat got hit by a gust of wind and turned sideways, right? And this caused like $50 billion worth of damage. And if you think about the vast stretches of human history, it was not possible for a single boat to cause $50 billion of economic damage in the past. But we
Mhm.
engineered systems that have no resilience. They're extremely brittle precisely because they are optimized to the limit, right? So when anything goes wrong, when the little noise or randomness of life enters the picture, everything falls apart. And this is why, when you think about the 21st century, you have all these calamities, which are sometimes called black swans, like September 11th or the financial crisis or the Arab Spring or the pandemic, where these little tiny changes have huge consequences that sort of blow up the way our world works. And so what I think is sort of important to figure out is what are the areas of your life in which you absolutely should optimize? And what are the areas of your life where you should think about resilience much more and efficiency a little bit less? And basically it's trying to figure out which kind of problem you're facing and whether it's totally controllable and totally understood or totally uncontrollable and totally not understood. So for example, in Fluke, I talk about this book, Moneyball, which you may have seen. There's a film about it with Brad Pitt in it. And it's basically about baseball. And what they're showing is they're showing that in this very, very ordered world of sports, where the rules are clearly defined, the players are limited, you sort of know what's going to happen, even if you don't know the outcome of the game. One of the two teams is going to win. In that world, it makes complete sense to optimize. And that's what they did. They used data analytics, they used analysis, and they tried to get as efficient as possible. And it worked. But so much of our world is not like that. There's not clear rules. There's not clear predictable outcomes. A lot of things that are totally unforeseeable are going to happen, which is what chaos theory talks about. And so in that world, you need to put more of a premium on resilience and slightly less of a premium on optimization. So I think I'm swimming up the stream a little bit in the industry because I'm basically saying, I think there's some of our lives where we're actually generating risk. We're actually generating brittleness precisely because we don't have enough slack in our systems. And that could be in your life. I mean, just a little bit more time to pause, to relax, to have a little bit of extra that's left over, that's not squeezed out as inefficiency. And I think that's the sort of lesson that both our societies and ourselves could benefit from, to follow the advice. My grandfather gave me the best advice I've ever been given, which was the successful life is one in which you avoid catastrophe. And I think a lot of us don't think about the sort of avoiding catastrophe. We think about the optimizing the last
Mhm.
2%. And I think that it's a mistake. I think we should be focusing a lot more on resilience.
So I actually did wonder about that. I know you do not talk about success per se in your book, but it is a underlying story for why people optimize in general. And this advice that maybe optimizing to the extreme is counterproductive really spoke to me. But how can you actually convince if the whole world the conversation that we are having as a contemporary society is all about success, optimizing who's the working yourself to to pieces in essence. How do you come with this kind of approach into society which uh, is going in the opposite direction to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question both about values and about strategy, right? So I'll start with the strategy and then I'll talk about the values. So the strategy aspects of this, I think one of the problems that you see, and this is something that social scientists have remarked upon before, is that when somebody gets successful, we assume that it was a clear A to B transition, and that if we follow the same variables, and in other words, if we do A, then we will also get B, just like Jeff Bezos did, or Elon Musk, or Mark Zuckerberg, or whatever it is, right? So all you need to do is sort of put the right recipe together, and then the cake will come out, and you'll be very, very successful. The problem
Mhm.
is that success, especially on the high echelons of society, the people that we know about, is a really partly random process. It's not that there's no correlation with talent. It's that there's a significant part that's due to luck. So
Mhm.
there's a study that was done by some economists and some physicists who worked together, where they basically engineered a fake society in which there was sort of an average distribution of talent. So lots of really sort of average level talent, some extremely talented people, but not as many, some not so talented people, again, not as many. And it followed sort of this bell curve distribution. So sort of like an inverted U shape.
Mhm.
Now, they then developed this sort of simplified model of society where you would have a correlation between talent and success, but there would also every so often be lucky events that happened, like a bolt
Mhm.
of lightning, right? That would sort of strike somebody in the group. And what they found was that the richest person in their society almost always was from the middle level of talent. And that wasn't because they were the best. It was
Mm.
because when luck strikes like lightning, it's most likely to hit where the most people are, right? It's most
Mm.
likely to hit the people in the middle because there's the most of them. So in their society that they constructed, the model never showed that the most talented person was the richest. It was never the case, right? Because there were so few of those extremely talented people. So I think there's this lesson that we can learn from that, which is that we should not conflate success and wealth and so on with necessarily the perfect strategy nor with the best talent. There's an element of chance and luck in this. And so if you base your life off of sort of following those who were successful, you might actually end up quite astray. You might end up following advice that doesn't work unless you also get lucky, which you certainly can't control. So I
Mhm.
think there's some of that we have to sort of correct, that it's not that these people have secret wisdom that if we just replicate, we'll also
Mhm.
be super rich. But I also think there's other aspects to this in terms of thinking about the way we contemplate success. I mean, a lot of the things that I have benefited from in my life, I had absolutely nothing to do with. I didn't decide where I was born. I didn't decide when I was born. I didn't decide who my parents were. I didn't decide what my brain was
Yeah.
like. I mean, all those things were hugely important in my success. And when I
Mhm.
go around the world and go to places that are extremely poor in my research, like Madagascar, where the average person lives on $1.50 a day, I mean, those people aren't just not talented. They're just really unlucky in terms of where they ended up being born. And so I
Mhm.
think there's a disconnect between how we talk about success as though it's purely earned and purely
Mhm.
deserved, and how the world actually works, which has a lot more room for chance and sort of random luck and so on. But I think
Yeah.
on the values point, I wanted to get back to that. I mean, for me personally, writing this book really upended the way I think about the world and the way I think about my own life as well, because I think that I was told, I mean, I grew up in the United States. I live in the UK now, but the US is this place where the American dream and the messages of it are all tied to sort of success, which is conflated often with wealth.
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, it's certainly the case that having a bit more money so you're not stressed is a driver of health and happiness and so on. But I think we've taken it too far. I think this idea that the only way to be successful or happy is to have lots and lots of disposable income in order to basically buy stuff or obtain status, right? These sort of two things, stuff and status. I think that makes a lot of people really unhappy because
Mhm.
it's like, there's this term of the hedonic treadmill, which is sort of,
Yeah.
you're constantly trying to get something better. So you get a promotion and then the next promotion is what you fixate on, or you buy a TV and now, oh, what if I got a projector? And I think that, for me over time, writing this book was really a cathartic experience where I started to think a little bit more about the arbitrary nature of the world in how some things happen inexplicably due to chaos theory or randomness and so on. And for me, I just started thinking, some of the most joyful moments in my life have been ones that are not remotely tied to success in the form of stuff or status. They're
Mhm.
instead tied to passion or happiness or enjoying life with other people. And I think that there's a corrective that needs to be done in some of the personal growth arguments that are made that also says, look, there's an incredible wealth of things that are amazing about the world that don't cost any money and that you can enjoy. And so I'm
Mhm.
not trying to say that if you're poor, right? I mean, this is something where obviously if you're poor and your necessities are not met, by all means, it is super important to get out of poverty. But for a lot of people, I think there's this mantra of never enough. And I think sometimes it is enough. I think sometimes we have enough stuff and status to be happy, and the sort of endless pursuit of more is actually what makes us miserable. So this also links back to the strategy point, by the way, because the things that I've been by far the most successful in life have been the things I cared about. And I think
Mhm.
something that we get told often about hustle culture, where it's
Yeah.
sort of indicative that like you have to really grind your way to success, I actually think it's quite bad advice because when you're unhappy, you're usually ineffective. So,
Mhm.
I think that pursuing passions is something that both has intrinsic value to make us happy, but also often makes us more successful.
Thank you for this very profound answer. And I want to remind people who are live, listening to us live, to leave your questions in the chat, actually in the Q&A, not in the chat, then I'll be able to bring them up. If you're watching it in recording, you can still leave the questions. Maybe I'll pass them over to Brian. I want to come back to the success story, not success story, but the narrative of success. And I'm glad that you mentioned hustle culture, but I want to twist it around a little bit because you said that research shows that a lot of, or at least that simulation that you were talking about shows that a lot of the times the luck strikes where there is the biggest probability or the biggest group of people. What would you say about the newest tendency to teach people how to attract luck and to, in a way, try to tame the chaos, in a different way, try to tame the chaos?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an impulse, and there's an evolved human impulse to want
Mhm.
to be able to control the world. I mean, I think this is something that makes complete sense as the way that our brains have evolved to basically be pattern detection machines and survival machines. And what I mean by that is that when you think about how humans have come to be and how we've gone through the generations after generations after generations of hunter-gatherers and then into, farmers and then and so on to industrialists, everything about our brains has been honed by the fact that when we understand cause and effect relationships and when we can control the world more effectively, it's easier to survive, right? Now, the problem is that in the past, the world was a lot more straightforward. So if you lived in a hunter-gatherer society, you sort of, you understood how these things worked. You sort of understood the migration patterns of animals you were trying to hunt, or you understood how to gather berries. We live in a world that is totally unlike that, right? The world that we live in is the most complex world that has ever existed. 8
Mhm.
billion interconnected human beings, all doing different things, sometimes irrationally, sometimes rationally, different religions, totally different economic structures, and they're all connected, right? So even the best minds who study this stuff, social scientists, et cetera, we don't understand the way the world works. And I don't mean this in the sense that there's no knowledge in these fields. I mean that when economic calamities happen, they blindside us, right? When pandemics happen, they blindside us. And that means that the lesson is that there's certain parts of the world that are genuinely untamable. And that, I think, also then therefore links to luck, which is to say that there are things that you cannot do to tame or harness or attract luck, in my opinion. There are
Mhm.
things you can do to prepare for luck, right? And I think that's a very big difference. It's that you can't say I'm going to become lucky, especially when the way that I'm defining luck in this, right, is
Mhm.
something that is completely arbitrary and random.
Mhm.
So, sometimes people will use the word luck to determine something or to describe something that is actually not really about luck. It's about preparation or talent or whatever it is. So, if somebody hits a basketball shot during a big game, but they've spent 20,000 hours practicing, they weren't lucky. They may have prepared themselves to be in that moment and so on. But the bounce might be lucky, the bounce of the ball, right? And that sort of stuff, I think, is something where when you think that way, I find it actually quite liberating. There's a mantra that I repeat in Fluke, which I believe is scientifically true if you take chaos theory literally, but also to me, very comforting. And the mantra is this: it says, "We control nothing, but we influence everything." Right?
Mhm.
And this is tied to this idea that every action we take, every word we say, yeah, I give a lot of examples, which we can come back to perhaps later on. But from one where you're constantly chasing control, trying to harness luck in a way that conjures it to you, to one where you accept influence, it flips the way that you think about your world slightly. And I think it's actually a much more enriching way to live, to think that every action we do, every choice we make, every person we encounter in our lives, we're part of this sort of intermeshed web that creates change. And it affects the trajectories of our lives, it affects the trajectories of other people's lives, and in aggregate, it affects the way that society actually operates as well. That doesn't mean that it's comforting because you can't have this top-down control, right? Which is something that people often want or think they want. But I actually think that you're more doomed to being upset if you chase something that is absolutely impossible, which is to say controlling the world. And
Mhm.
that means, things like I'll just draw luck to me. And so instead, what I think about is how can I prepare if luck were to strike? And also, how can I direct my life in a way where the influences I produce feel empowering and meaningful to me? And I think
Mhm.
that's stuff where, a lot of us fixate on the outcome, which sometimes is something we can't always control. I like to fixate on the sort of existence part of being, right? Sort of what am I doing? Am I enjoying my life? Do I find passion in it? And I think those things actually more often than not, as I said before, do actually produce things that are both lucky and successful because we're engaged, we're passionate, and we're more likely to do the things that actually yield good outcomes in the process.
You know, Brian, as I was reading a book, I couldn't help feeling that it's like a very, very spiritual message, disguised in a in a academic and researched language. I really enjoyed, especially by the end of it. I want to ask. Actually, I wanted to ask something. I know I forgot about it. What a weird fluke in my brain. You know what? Since I forgot, I'm actually asking the question that, oh, yes, no, I remember now. It's an important question. I also had it since I started reading the book. So, one of the important tenets, probably, of personal growth is that you have to take responsibility for your life, which, in a way, also demands some level of control, or at least it pushes you to try to control or to try to plan things which are unplannable and uncontrollable. On the other hand, if you admit that yes, everything is out of your control, life is uncertain and unpredictable, isn't there danger of falling into the victimhood mentality, which is not productive at all? And how do you integrate the idea of responsibility, personal responsibility, in this understanding that world, in essence, is not under your control?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a few things to say. One is that chaos theory and the sort of basics of I should explain what chaos theory is first. So chaos theory, which some of you may have heard of from the butterfly effect, is this idea that really small changes can have really big effects. And I will get to your question in a slightly roundabout way with a personal story. So one of the first stories in the book is a story about a woman named Clara Maudlin Jansen who lived in Wisconsin around 1905 when she died. And in 1905, she had a mental breakdown and had 4 young children. And it's a very sad, tragic story. She decided to take the lives of her 4 kids and then took her own life. And the reason I'm telling you this is because when I was in my mid-20s, my dad sat me down at the kitchen table and showed me this newspaper clipping about Clara Maudlin Jansen. And he said, "This is your great-grandfather's first wife." And it turned out that she had killed the whole family minus my great-grandfather. And then my great-grandfather remarried to what became my great-grandmother. And so in that instant, I realized that that mass murder produced my life, right? That in other words, not only would I not exist if those children had not been killed, but that you would not be on this call, right? You would not be watching this video or hearing my voice if those children had not died in 1905. Now, that is relevant for the question of responsibility and predictability and control, because everything good in my life was produced by a mass murder 119 years ago, right? I mean, that's literally true. It's obviously true, because if that had not happened, then I would not be part of the lineage that exists. So that's true of my dad's life. It's true of my grandfather's life. You know, it's true. It's true of this lineage for my entire family. But what that means is that sometimes really horrible things that people do have really positive outcomes later on that are completely unpredictable, like a Zoom call in 2024 being produced by a mass murder in 1905. But the flip side is also that sometimes really great things that you do can produce negative consequences later on in life. So, for example, you could plant a tree tomorrow, and in 100 years, a child could fall out of it and die. And these things are possible. But this doesn't mean that we should just absolve control and absolve responsibility, because we still think probabilistically. And what I mean by that is, even though it is possible that I plant a tree and it leads to some child falling out of it and dying 100 years from now, on balance, planting trees is good, right? So you can still have this notion that you don't know what the consequences of your actions will be, but still produce consequences that are intended to be positive, right? And that's the way that I think all of us should live. We have this sort of notion of morality and notion of values. And yes, chaotic dynamics mean that sometimes, they don't play out the way that we think they would. But they produce these sorts of incredible, monumental bits of change. I mean, the first story in the book is about this in the world of history, where a couple went on vacation to Kyoto, Japan, and in 1926, and 19 years later, the husband ended up as America's Secretary of War. And the generals wanted to bomb Kyoto with the first atomic bomb, the bomb that ultimately went to Hiroshima. And the only reason it went to Hiroshima was because the man who had gone on vacation in 1926 didn't want this city that he visited to get destroyed. So he went to President Truman and got it taken off the list. Now, the vacation was neutral, right? There's nothing good or bad about going on vacation somewhere. I mean, I guess it's a little bit good, but it produced this consequence that meant that 100,000 people died in one city rather than another. So I think you can simultaneously embrace the chaos of life and the sort of uncontrollability of the world and accept that, right? And sort of embrace uncertainty a little bit more, but also live a life that is moral and aimed with justice and responsibility and trying to better your lot in life, right? I mean, even though I understand that a lot of chaotic and random events have led to any success that I have, I still strive, right? It's not, I don't just give up. I don't just sit in bed and think maybe luck will strike and somebody will call me and just offer me a lot of money. I still strive, right? I still try. And I think that's something where you can simultaneously accept the intellectual aspects of chaos, where there are some parts of the world that are genuinely out of your control, and that's fine, but also still try to navigate them as though you have control, right? And I think that's the sort of difference. It's important to recognize that it's not true that you're in charge of your life exclusively. It's just simply not true. There's so many things that affect your success, from whether you're born in the first place to your childhood, all sorts of aptitudes that you may or may not have. Like, those things you didn't decide, right? And they affect your success. But you can simultaneously acknowledge that and still try. And I think that's the way that I square the circle. Is I think it's actually a happier way to live, to acknowledge the limits of your control, but then try to maximize the way that you influence the world according to your values and passions and desires and the people you care about and so on. And so that's how I sort of reconcile the two ideas, even though they seem like they're opposed.
Mhm. Thank you. I love this answer. On a side note, I will say that my life was also possible to mass murder because I was born in Soviet Union, and the two countries, Estonia and Belarus, were in one country at some point, thanks to, if I can say the word thanks in that context, pretty bloodthirsty dictatorship. So I kind of relate here, but on a slightly more positive note, I want to read out some of the questions. I have some questions that I have about the book, but I want to give the chance to you guys who are attending live to ask your questions. So I'll read out your questions first, and then if we have time, I'll ask a little bit more. So a question came from Aidin. How can we bring our relation with the environment and the balance with society into the picture?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I have a chapter in the book that's called The Lottery of Earth. And it's all about how geography and geology affect human trajectories down to our own individual lives. I mean, the places we're born are really important to dictating the way that our lives turns out. And I think the reason I mention this in the context of your question is because I think a lot of us are trained to think of ourselves as individuals who are totally separate from the underlying system that surrounds us. I mean, the American dream and some of the other sort of mentalities that we're sort of overwhelmed with in childhood imagine that we're this aloof agent that doesn't need to worry about the rest of the world, right? And I think when you start to think about us as the byproducts of an interconnected world, which includes not just 8 billion other people, but also the natural world, you start to think differently about how important that is, right? And so, to my mind, I think there's this aspect where the modeling that I was talking about before, right, where you sort of try to reduce reality into this very straightforward, neat and tidy story where only a few things matter. You may have heard these phrases of separating the signal from the noise and so on. That allows us to imagine that the natural world is unimportant in the future of our lives. And it's not, right? We rely on it all the time. And its health and our health are intertwined. This idea, I mean, linguistically, we also have this idea, right? So the thinker Alan Watts talks about this, where he says, we talk about coming into the world when, of course, we've come out of the world, right? We've been reproduced as atoms that already existed and then have been rearranged into a human. Or when we talk about going into nature, as though we're not already in nature. I'm sitting in nature right now. It's part of the natural world, right? So when I think about those dynamics, I start to have a healthier appreciation for being part of a system. And I think that links to the previous question about responsibility too, because I'm not just an individual, right? The way that I behave doesn't just affect the people immediately around me. It affects the way the world will unfold, and it will affect which humans might get born in the future. Because, this is one of the things that's really mind-bending about thinking about chaos is that when you think about when a child is born, for example, that moment, if it's even a millisecond difference in terms of when the child's conceived, rather, if it's even a millisecond difference of the moment of conception, a different kid will get born. And so if the parent in that situation stops to have a sip of coffee that day, they're going to have a different kid, right? But that's also true for the day before that. It's true for whether I had a conversation with someone. I'm going to affect the trajectory of their life, which will then manifest in a different person. So, everything we do is important. And I think this is something where the third part of the subtitle of the book is why everything we do matters. I mean that quite literally. And I think this is where the sort of natural world fits in, is that there's not a separation between me and other people and the natural world. We're all part of one giant system. And imagining ourselves as aloof or outside of it is a huge mistake, not just because you misunderstand the world, but because it also doesn't give you an appreciation for the responsibility of being alive and what it means to influence other people's lives as well.
I really loved in your book, you brought a little bit maybe extreme view of how what is individual and how it's also a little bit of an illusion because we are inhabited by quite a lot of life. By the way, to everybody who hasn't read the book yet, I strongly recommend, and that's the first time I'm actually recommending a book in Mindvalley Book Club, but it's really one of the books which I think is going to be talked about for years, and I believe it's really worth the time, and it's so exciting exciting and so interesting to read. Another question that I will read out, I'll first read out the shorter questions. So question came from Anonymous attendee. Would you recommend, leaving an unfulfilling 9-to-5 job to have time, energy to pursue your passions, dreams? Would appreciate your perspective.
Yeah, this is a really great question. It's one that I think a lot of people are grappling with. I mean, I think there's a sense in modern society by quite literally millions, even possibly billions of people, that they wish they had more time and they wish they had more fulfillment in life, right? And I think, I think it depends on the situation a lot. I think I'll answer it this way. If you find joy and meaning and purpose outside of the 9-to-5, and you find no meaning in the 9-to-5, then the only catastrophe can exist if you accidentally believe that your purpose is in the 9-to-5 job you don't care about. Right? So in other words, I think the saddest way to live is to have a job that gives you absolutely no meaning or fulfillment, but make it central to the meaning of your life. So that you feel that if I don't get this promotion in this job that I really don't think is actually that important, then I won't be a happy person. Those people are the most miserable because they have mistaken something that is for money, right? In that instance, they're just doing the job for earning money to pay the bills for something that is about purpose. So if you have a job that doesn't give you purpose, then you need to ramp up finding ways to feel purpose and meaning and joy in everything else, right? And there's a lot of people who can do that. And I think that's a very happy way to live. The people who work 80 hours a week in a purposeless, life a job that they find meaningless, that's a recipe for despair. And I think it's really problematic when people do that. So you either want to do one of two things. You either want to find a job that you like, or you want to find a way to separate out the job from the things that do give you purpose. Or if you're able to afford it, you can, yes, do something a little bit less demanding of your time. I mean, for me, I will say that the things that have given me the most success personally, and this is, I'm in a creative industry. I write, for example, I'm a professor, but I also write books and so on. The things that have given me the best ideas have been when I've given myself the space to do something that scientists call leisure time invention. And this is a scientifically verified concept, which is completely at odds with how many businesses operate today. So a lot of businesses conflate work with time and productivity with time. And it's not always the case that this is a good proxy, right? So if you're on an assembly line, if you're making something, then yes, it's probably the case that if you put in 40 hours, you're going to have 40 hours of output. But this idea of leisure time invention is the idea that human brains need the space to think. They need the space to create. And so the history of this, there's some great examples from history. One is Galileo was sitting in this moment of quiet contemplation in a cathedral and looking at a chandelier that was swaying. And it moved him, but it also inspired him to invent the pendulum clock, right? So it's one of these things where he's watching this sort of swaying motion. He says, there's a regular nature to this. I can use this to keep time. So it was an innovation for timekeeping that was born out of a moment of quiet contemplation in a church. The Wright brothers invented the airplane after they were watching buzzards during a picnic. So they were not on the assembly line, losing their minds just sort of with boredom. They were just having a picnic. And there's all sorts of evidence in science that shows that it's the case that when we free ourselves up to have a little bit of space, our brains actually perform better. They're more creative, more innovative, and so on. Mm-hmm. And in modern economies, a lot of our jobs actually rely on that, right? There's fewer and fewer jobs that are all about manufacturing on an assembly line and more that are about creativity and innovation and smart thinking and so on. And yet I don't think our businesses have adapted to this enough. I think there's a sort of mentality of if you don't have your butt in the chair, you're not being productive or doing your job and so on. So, to my mind, I think there's, finding a way to have exploration and have moments of contemplation are really important. This book, a lot of it was written after I went for a long walk with my dog. I would sit and stare at my computer and it would just, I'd write trash. It would be terrible sentences. I would just delete them all, go on a walk with my dog, and it would just flow out of me. And I think there's some of that where a lot of the stuff we're told about optimization and life hacks and so on, imagine those dog walks as things that are wastes of time. right? Fill them with podcasts, fill them with all these other, sometimes that's good, right? Sometimes we need to sort of be inspired by other people's ideas. Sometimes I just walk outside and look at things and sort of just am in awe of the natural world around me. And then all of a sudden the creativity flows. So, I know it sounds a little bit Zen, a little bit Eastern philosophy, but I actually think that there's some wisdom in this, where a lot of the 9 to 5 jobs stamp this out of us. But please do not hold me accountable if you quit your job and end up miserable and poor, because I do know that we need to, you need to pay the bills. I'm not someone who's such a romantic thinker that imagines just, become a hermit in the woods and everything will turn out okay. So you'll have to make that choice for yourself.
But actually, what I appreciate about your book, especially in the end, you're talking about the rice problem versus rubber problem, which actually brings a lot of reason. I know it sounds probably very funny in this context, but it brings reason to that philosophy. But before we go into that, and people probably don't know what is rice problem and what is rubber problem, I want to ask another question. You mentioned chaos in the very beginning of your answer, and also your granddad suggested that you should live without, not chaos, sorry, catastrophe.
Yeah.
Catastrophe. You should live without catastrophe. In your book, you explain a very interesting causality where people trying to predict the future and trying to maybe avert risk, I would say, end up creating the catastrophe. Could you explain this? How is this possible when you're trying to make it, well, as scientific as possible, as predictable as possible, as safe as possible, you create the opposite?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about, I'm borrowing from a physics concept in this section known as the sand pile model. And it sounds very complex, but it's actually a very simple analogy for understanding how our lives can be either more resilient or more fragile. So the sand pile model is basically, imagine that I take a grain of sand and I put it into a pile and I start to add 1 grain of sand at a time until the pile gets bigger and bigger and bigger. At some point, the pile of sand is going to be so big and so precarious that there's going to be an avalanche when I add the last grain of sand, right? Now, the reason that's important is because the last grain of sand wasn't different from all the other ones. It's sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It created this catastrophe and this cascade. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because in our social worlds or in our own lives, I think we're often told to build the grain of sand pile as tall as possible, right? This is what optimization is. This is what the sort of controlling the world is. And so, I think we've done this a lot of different times in modern society. I mean, I'll talk about this in the social world, and then I'll talk about it in our own lives in a second. So the financial crisis is a perfect example of this, right? It's like you've got all these things that are supposed to be as efficient as possible in the world of finance. And then boom, one thing happens, 1 grain of sand fails, and the whole thing falls apart. And I think we would have been better off having a lower grain of sand pile, right? I mean, a lower sand pile in the first place, so that each grain of sand wouldn't cause an avalanche. And I think this is the sort of world of trying to enforce control on what is ultimately an uncontrollable world. It can blow up in our faces. And so when you think about this analogy for your own life, you think, okay, I could build I could build the sand pile as tall as possible. I could do every life hack. I could hustle every moment of every day. But what happens if something goes a little bit wrong? And I think a lot of us don't plan that way. A lot of us end up in this world where it's all about the sort of upside and none about planning for the catastrophic downside. But catastrophe happens. I mean, it's just the nature of life. It could be in health, it could be in finance, it could be in anything, relationships and so on. And so, when the sand pile is a little bit lower, then it makes us resilient. And so I think, for me personally, one of the things that I've done more since I've adjusted my worldview after writing this book is just thinking a little bit less about how I can squeeze the last little bit out of what life could give me and appreciate a bit more what I have in life, but also plan for disaster. And I don't mean this in sort of like building some like bomb shelter. I mean, thinking about, what are the things that are truly resilient about my life? And for me personally, and this won't be true for everyone, I mean, I've realized there's a lot of stuff I enjoy doing that if I lost all my money, I could still do. I love walking my dog. I love going camping. I mean, these things are cheap, right? Now, of course, it's nice to make money. It's nice to be able to have some sort of, flexibility and not be stressed about cash and so on. But I also think that there's sort of an appreciation you can have for the things like relationships, which don't cost any money, for the things like the natural world, which doesn't cost any money. And deriving some meaning and joy in your identity from those things, whether it's a family member or a partner or a friend, that I think is also a form of social resilience, because when we're knocked down by catastrophe, those relationships are still there. And so, I think that's the sort of stuff that sometimes is missing from the narrative, that we always have to get more. I mean, there's a quote that I have in the book from the sociologist Hartmut Rosa, where he talks about how a lot of modern life discourse is about trying to capture and control an ever greater slice of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's the best advice for everyone. I also don't think, and this is one thing that is really important, is that a lot of the advice we're given, like if you go to a life hack website, it's not like a life hack for Brian Klaas website. It's a life hack for everyone. But we're
Mm-hmm.
really different, right? All 8 billion people have different values, different interests, different passions, different goals. And yet we all are trying to get the same script about how to live a life. And I think that's very counterproductive. I think there's things that we can do to maximize success and to think strategically and to strive and so on and to better ourselves. But there's also, you've got to write your own recipe. And I think that's something where sometimes, we just need to be reminded that what we derive as meaningful in our lives is enough. And it's okay if you don't have the stuff and status that you dreamed of, 10 or 15 years ago. You can still be a very happy and productive person in society.
Mm. Thank you for this answer. We have a question and a background, and that will be the last one because I am already past the time I would normally finish an interview. But a question came from, well, Pineda Webmaster, I'm not sure. How can we make both sides on both spectrums, talented and not talented, lucky and not lucky, as you mentioned, come together to avoid the damage humanity could potentially bring due to unawareness? Are we destined to fight for those who can't do anything, or can we somehow do something to help those on the bottom side of the balance in order to save the boat before we all drown? And how do we enable those on the top to be willing to help? I hope you understood.
I did, yeah. It's a great question. It's a question about sort of social inequality and how we can make a world that's more just, I think, at its core. And I think this is one of the areas where I think there is a mismatch in the world between the things that help people and the things that are financially rewarded. And very often those who are the biggest helpers, the altruists, the selfless people, and so on, are not those with the fattest bank accounts. And there's a problem there. I think the way that I can think about this in my world of control is to think about the influence that I personally have on other people. I can't control what billionaires do. What I can do is try to have some form of legacy where I make the world a little bit better for other people. And I think that's the sort of stuff that is somehow absent from our political discourse, is absent from a lot of the sort of narratives around how we should live and so on. I think most people get a huge amount of meaning from helping others. And I think, when I look at these, I'm not trying to pick on the life hacks because occasionally I use them, right, to save time or whatever. But the world of extreme life hacks is a world in which you think that the pathway to happiness and meaning is through eliminating inefficiency. And I think it denies some of our humanity. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think about the meaning of their life, it's always socially derived. In other words, it's about the people who you're connected to. It's about the people that you shared life with. And sometimes it's about the impact that you had on those who are less fortunate than you. And you don't see this in a life hack, right? It's not about how you can improve your life by, here are these 10 things that will help you be more charitable. It's more about, productivity. So I wish there was a way to sort of engineer society. And if you're interested in this, I'm not trying to plug the other book, but I wrote 250 pages about power. So in this book called Corruptible. So that's more of my answer in long form. But I think there are social reforms that need to happen. I mean, we need to restructure society in some pretty important ways around power and how it's used to the greatest effect. But in the meantime, I think each of us individually can think a little bit more about the things that truly give us meaning in life. And when we're honest with ourselves, I think a lot of us are not swayed on our deathbed by how much stuff we had. And this doesn't mean that you shouldn't, seek to be successful. Success is its own reward. It's something that is very, very rewarding for people when they're passionate and they get success. And of course, having money is better than not having money. But it is also something where I think we need to remember in the grand scheme of things, life is about more than success and status, and that given the arbitrary, chaotic nature of the world, we all can do our part to have ripples of influence that will outlast us and our time on the planet and so on. And I think that's the message that I try to live in my own life.
Mm. Thank you so much. We are about to finish this wonderful interview. I'm so grateful you came. For people who are here, if you want to continue this conversation, I strongly recommend you go to Amazon and get the book. I don't have any affiliation with that, so it's just a genuine suggestion. I want to ask maybe the last question. Meanwhile, also the tradition. I want you guys who are live to leave a heart for my wonderful guests, and those who are going to look in the recording, then please leave it in the comments. Brian, the last question for you is, who did you write your book for? Who is it for? I know you didn't write for people who are interested in personal growth per se, but I think it speaks to us.
I think I wrote this book in a way for two audiences. And one of them is people who are trying to make sense of an incredibly bewildering, rapidly changing world where they feel despair about their lack of control and are only told that the solution is more control, right? And I think it's a large number of people. I think the book is trying to say to them, you're not going to get it. You're never going to control this uncontrollable world. So what's a better alternative? And the second person that I wrote the book for was myself. And I know that sounds very selfish, but this book totally upended my worldview. It was the most rewarding thing I've ever worked on in my life. And it's sort of born of these questions that all of us ask about what the meaning of life is. Why do things happen to us and so on? And I spent 2.5 years thinking about that, reading incredibly widely from, quantum mechanics to evolutionary biology to philosophy and so on. And it's my answer. And it's my answer that I'm hoping other people will find influential and rewarding in their own lives. Because I think that there's a large number of people who are struggling, and they're struggling unnecessarily because they're given the wrong answers to a lot of these huge questions that we ask ourselves. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's a wonderful answer. Thank you. And I will repeat this. It's a really great book. I wish you the best of luck, because I know the lightning strikes. It's not just hard work, but luck is always needed, even when you've done a lot of good work already. So wish you a lot of luck with your book. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Brian, for joining me and for being my first guest in this series. I'm really proud. I'm really honored, and I'm really happy that it happened. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.